we're coming into this election cycle in 2024. These suburban moms are one of the swing vote demographics that sometimes impacts the outcome of an election. They're the proverbial suburban women who are supposed to be socially liberal but economically conservative because their husbands are, and yet they swing a little bit towards the left because of those social issues. Well, they're swinging towards the right on these social issues. I feel very encouraged by this. It's not just anecdotal, it's more than anecdotal, because when you have a group of women, moms, especially moms of very young children, so toddlers and primary school grade children, when these moms are looking at the world and they are looking at the institutions that many of us were raised with, many of us were used to deferring to, we thought, oh, they're the experts, they know best, we will operate according to what they must know. When these moms are looking at those institutions and they're thinking, watch out, institutions, we don't trust you anymore, then those institutions better watch out. And that is a good thing. So back to this podcast for a second. It's called Sold a Story, and it is yet another institution that's been corrupted. So the CDC is maybe the example that is the most black and white example of the CDC was viewed by a lot of people, even in the Republican Party, even in the conservative movement, as an institution to be trusted. These were the medical experts. These are the scientists. These are the people that know about health. You defer to the CDC on really big decisions about yourself and your family. Just 3 or 4 years ago, the majority of people in our country believed that. The people who questioned the CDC were really in the minority. It was like the moms who questioned vaccines because their children had a vaccine injury, or naturopaths who thought that you could do a little more functional lifestyle medicine and not so much prescription, but really preventative medicine. There were really just a few factions of people that questioned the CDC. Most people didn't. And now it's the reverse. It's completely the reverse. The same thing with pediatricians. A couple years ago, you had a question about parenting, you went to your pediatrician. And now, moms aren't even taking their kids to the pediatrician because the American Academy of Pediatricians has been captured by trans ideology and DEI, critical race theory, poisonous ideology, dangerous, harmful ideology to our children. And I mean, we don't even have to get into the public schools, right? The public schools with the same thing, the trans ideology and critical race theory. All of these institutions they're not crumbling, but our eyes have been opened to the fact that they have been captured. Well, this podcast called Sold a Story exposes another institution, one I didn't even realize was captured, but an institution that touches literally almost every one of our children, and our children when they are at very, very young ages. Let me tell you a little bit about what I listened to on this podcast. So it's called Sold a Story Podcast. I highly recommend you look it up. I think it's probably everywhere that you can find your podcast. I listened to it on Apple Podcasts. It's a 6-part series put on by a reporter by the name of Emily Hanford. Probably you've never heard of her. She's an education reporter. I had never heard of her until I listened to this podcast. This podcast was sent to me by my friend Lauren. My friend Lauren, she didn't send it to me for any political reason. She is a homeschooling mom. She has 4 beautiful little girls. She sent it to me because I'm planning to homeschool my daughter. My husband and I are going to homeschool our daughter. And she thought that it was fascinating, and it is. The premise of this podcast is that 67% of 4th graders in the United States are below grade level for reading proficiency. That's 2/3. 2 out of every 3 4th graders read below grade level. And this doesn't go away after 4th grade. It's not just something that they ultimately learn to compensate for. In 8th grade, 64% of 8th graders are at or below grade level for reading proficiency. This is a significant problem. It's a problem for, if you want to zoom all the way out, it's a problem for our country as a whole as we continue to try to compete on the global level economically and scientifically and militarily. We need really smart, really well-educated people to be able to do that, to innovate, to grow. Well, we're not training our school children to be competent readers. How are we going to have competent thinkers and people who can be leaders in the world, let alone in our country, let alone in our businesses, let alone in our family life? This is a big problem. Big problem. Parents understand that. So the idea is this education reporter, Emily Hanford, investigates, well, what happened? Why are we failing children? And this, by the way, this statistic is not it's not just inner city schools, right? Or Black children that are failing while affluent neighborhoods with white children are doing well. This has nothing to do with racial divide. This has nothing to do with socioeconomic status. This is consistent across the board, which you could argue, especially as it relates to socioeconomic status, makes it even stranger. Because oftentimes you'll have failing schools in areas that are poorer, whether it's a rural area, maybe Appalachia, or whether it's an inner city school in Chicago. These poorer schools with children that come from lower socioeconomic status do worse than public schools in richer areas, but not with reading. With reading, it is pretty consistent across the board. So Emily Hanford investigates and finds that this idea has infiltrated, or an idea has infiltrated our public school system about how to teach children to read. Now, you and I might be thinking, okay, well, like phonics, right? Like oh, that's how we all learned to read. Ball. That's how we learned to read. That's how we became proficient readers. Well, evidently, that is not how children are taught to read in the public school system anymore. Phonics is not in school. Phonics is not a thing. You are not taught to sound out words. You are not taught how to read in school anymore because an idea has infiltrated this institution, an idea without any basis whatsoever that, and probably won't be surprised about this idea that is without science, without basis, that is ineffective, has profited certain people to the tune of over $1 billion. So this idea was first birthed by a woman named Mari Clay. Mari Clay was an education expert. I mean, you can hear the tone of voice that I'm using to say that. An education expert actually from New Zealand. And she came up with an idea or a theory that said that children shouldn't be taught to sound out words if they're struggling to read. They should be taught to use contextual clues to figure out what the word might be. Now, you might be thinking that sounds really bizarre, and it is. When I was listening to this podcast, it's hard to believe that this is in almost every public school in the United States, where children, if they're sitting there and they can't read, Jane kicked the ball. Instead of being taught, okay, well, what is that letter and how do you sound it out? They are taught to look for context clues. What is the overall meaning? Can you decipher the meaning of the sentence without the word that you're struggling with? What might the word mean? Can you guess what you think that word might be? What does the picture tell you about what that word might be? Yes, they actually tell children to look at the picture instead of trying to decipher the word with phonics. This theory that Mari Clay, this education expert, came up with is called the cueing theory, where teachers are supposed to give students or point students towards cues, context cues about what the word is instead of teaching them to read that word. Hi guys, it's Liz Wheeler. Don't forget to watch my show, The Liz Wheeler Show, every night at 7 p.m. on the First TV. You can download the free First TV app, or you can visit thefirsttv.com/Liz and start watching today.